Hi, everybody, and welcome to our community session preparing for Reltio security changes. We will be covering everything that you can expect starting November 4th. Please keep in mind that this show will be recorded and posted to the Reltio community page. We ask that you hold on your questions until the end of the session, but you can always put them into the Q&A if you'd like, and then we will answer them at the end. Take a quick look at our safe harbor slide. And then I would like to welcome Sergio Abraham, the Principal Product Manager of Security and Compliance, and Andrew Citro, the Chief Information Security Officer here at Reltio, and I will pass it over to them.
Thank you. So just a bit of additional background. I'm Sergio, so I've been with Reltio for almost 3 years now. Responsible for any security requirements, security features, security products, security changes in the Reltio platform. So, Andrew?
Yes, Andrew Citro. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer here at Reltio. Joined the company about 3 years ago. I'm based in San Diego, and really oversee the security, compliance, and audit functions, kind of separate from our product and platform initiatives, but partner with Sergio as we roll out these kinds of changes.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so we're going to go through a summary of the changes that we're introducing starting next week, with some technical explanation of different scenarios. As we know, we usually see confusion in some cases. And providing some additional context of why we're doing this and how we are doing this. Because the end goal, of course, is to increase the level of security across our entire customer base. However, we also want to make sure that these changes do not disrupt any current business processes you have in place with Reltio. So, next slide, please. So, I assume at this point, everyone knows what Reltio is doing. Just as a recap, we are basically enhancing our authentication mechanisms with the Reltio platform. The Reltio recommendation is that all users must use SSO, single sign-on, integrating with your IDP. However, we understand in some cases that may be not possible. Let's say if you have a contractor or if you have special backup accounts, you don't want to be in SSO, then for those cases, MFA is mandatory. Reltio released MFA, the MFA feature a couple of months ago. So it's already available for all customers, but it hasn't been enforced yet. So starting November 4th, we will start with the rollout of this enforcement of these requirements in phases. And I will talk about the phases later. But it will not be everything in one go. Who is affected by this change? So if you're already using SSO, if your user is already authenticating to Reltio with SSO, then no changes. Everything stays the same. However, if you are not using SSO, then you will have to go through the MFA authentication mechanism. We will have two types of MFA. We have already two types of MFA, either with email-based verification, which is basically you authenticate into Reltio, you get a security code in your email, and then you input that security code as a second step, or the traditional authenticator-based. So Google Authenticator, Microsoft, any authenticator you have, I think almost everyone works with it. We have in the documentation the ones we support, but it's a big list. So basically, you go into Authenticator, you will see the code, and then input the code as a second step. The impact of this is not mainly on your human users, business users authenticating to Reltio to perform daily operations. The main impact is on the service accounts. If we follow standards, service accounts should be using client credentials. It means client ID and secret. However, that's not the case. And for a lot of Reltio customers and a lot of service accounts, they are using username and password, which are intended to be used by humans, not machines. So as soon as we enable MFA, as soon as we enforce MFA, these service accounts most likely will stop working. Why? Because these integrations are working automatically in automated business processes, and there is no way for the automation to input that second code. So we've been talking to customers for the past months to migrate service accounts to client credentials to avoid any disruption as soon as we enforce MFA. Next slide, please. Andrew.
Yeah, so I want to give a little bit of background as to why we are doing this. Earlier in the year, we identified, or we all saw that there was a specific threat actor working against Snowflake customers that were configured in their platform with single-factor authentication. Breached passwords were identified and reused, and some of their customer tenants were affected. So in response, we saw an industry-wide shift. Really, many of the data software as a service players are moving to stronger secure by default authentication methods to ensure just the continued safety and security of the customer's tenants and the customer's data on those platforms. So as Reltio is also doing this uplift, we're aiming to align to the current OAuth 2 standards. That is a public framework. It's the backbone of Reltio's kind of authentication authorization system. And we're really leveraging the current best practice grant types, like authorization code in replacement for the username and password grant type. Again, as Sergio mentioned, we do recommend the integration with SSO. That way it puts your identity provider kind of in the front and center of all the controls and the policy that you want to affect against your users on the Reltio platform. But these are kind of the backbone reasons as to why we're making this shift and making it now. Next slide.
So now we'd like to go through a few scenarios just to clarify, because we've been receiving several questions over the past months about how things will look like after we make these changes. And there are a few scenarios to consider. I am considering 4 different scenarios in this presentation. There may be more. I am talking about the most common ones. So let's imagine you have an SSO user, a user that only authenticates with SSO. This is a person, of course, and this person only has access to the production tenant. So, and you see below the 3 tenants, the development tenant doesn't have SSO configured, and the test and production tenants have SSO configured. With this combination of configurations, it means that that user can only access the production tenant via SSO. It cannot access the test tenant because it doesn't have the permissions for it. And it cannot access the dev tenant because the dev tenant doesn't have SSO and the user doesn't have permissions either. So in this way, this user is restricted to only access the production tenant. Next one, please. The next case, we are talking about an SSO user. This is more complex. An SSO user that has access to dev and test. It doesn't have access to production, but it is SSO. With the same setup of tenants in which dev is not SSO and the other 2 are SSO, this user will not be able to access production. Why? Because even if it is SSO, it doesn't have the permissions. The platform will kick the user out as soon as it tries to authenticate. It will be able to authenticate with the test tenant because it is SSO and it has permissions for it. But it won't be able to directly log into the development tenant. Why? Because the user is SSO and the development tenant is not SSO. So it's not possible to log in directly to that tenant. However, the user has permissions for it. So how this works is once the user authenticates into the test tenant, it can open another tab with the development tenant. So it can open a second tab. After logging into the test tenant, it can access the development tenant. And it's very important here to differentiate the authentication process in Reltio from the authorization process in Reltio. In the authentication process, in this case, it can only access the tenants that have SSO configured. But from a permissions standpoint, it can access dev and test. So although it cannot authenticate into the development tenant directly because it doesn't have the authentication mechanism to authenticate there, it can access the development tenant after authenticating into the test tenant. Next one, please. Now we are talking about another SSO user. I don't remember if this is a typo, but if let's say this is another SSO user, yeah, with access to the three of them. So similar to before, it won't be able to directly access the development tenant, but it can access both test and prod because it has the permissions for both. Now, if the user wants to access dev, it can go through any of those two. It can access test tenant and then move to development tenant, or can go to production tenant and then move to development tenant. Both paths work in the same way. Next one, please. Now, non-SSO. These are users that are not that are in Reltio configured as non-SSO. So let's say in this case, it only has access to dev and test. The user will be able to access the development tenant with MFA. Remember that MFA will be enforced, so with MFA, you can access the development tenant. Test tenant is a question mark because this one really depends on your IDP configuration. If this user that is non-SSO is present in your IDP, it will be able to access the test tenant as well. Even if it is not SSO, it will open the SSO login page for the test tenant. And as the user exists in the IDP, it is registered there, it will go through the SSO authentication. So in this case, for the test tenant, let's say for both dev and test, the same user can authenticate in two different ways. We don't recommend that. So we really recommend that if your user is in the IDP, it must use SSO. If the user is not, then you will use MFA. Having this mix of authentication mechanisms is not a good practice. We are just explaining the behavior if you fit into this scenario. Of course, the production tenant won't be able to access here because it doesn't have the permissions. Next one, please. This may be the last one. So similarly, now the same non-SSO user has access to the three tenants. Same as before, the user can access the login, the dev tenant with MFA, and it may or may not be able to access the test and pro tenant directly based on the IDP configuration. Now, let's say the user is properly configured, the user is not in the IDP. So the user cannot access test and pro directly. But the user can still access those tenants after authenticating into the development tenant. Remember the segregation of authentication and authorization. So from an authentication perspective, if the user is not SSO, the user may not be able to log into those two tenants, but the user has the permissions. So after authenticating to the development tenant, it can go to test and prod, just opening a different tab in the browser. So these are the most common scenarios we see in our customers. And we are only talking about human access here. This is not about service accounts. This is the different type of behaviors or patterns, login patterns and permissions patterns you can see in Reltio for people accessing the platform. Next one, please. So what will happen after November 4th? As we said, MFA is available, and we have customers already using MFA, and SSO has been in Reltio for several years now, but MFA is a new feature. Let's talk about this phase rollout. So we said that we will not do everyone at the same time. It will not be all customers in just one click. In an effort to reduce risk, we are basically doing phases or waves, starting with low usage, simpler, smaller customers, and moving up into larger, more complex customers in later phases and waves. We starting on Monday next week, but we will notify specifically each of you via in-app message when the specific day will be for you. So you will receive that communication, of course. You will know when that will happen. It will not be a surprise. But that will happen through in-app notifications, because we think that that may be the most effective channel. We will also send emails, of course. We always send emails, but the emails that we send are targeted to the main contacts we have in your accounts, in our customers. Emails are not for all users. So if you are not in this list, you will receive the notification via the in-app notification. Another very important point here is that we have a freeze period. I think this was communicated already, or we have an email coming out this week. We have a freeze period around Thanksgiving and another one around Christmas. So basically, for the entire holiday season, starting the week before Thanksgiving until end of year, we will not do the rollout. So we will start now. We will pause it in, I think it's November 18th, approximately, the week before Thanksgiving. And then we will continue the rollout after end of year. We want to avoid any critical changes during that period. Again, as I said earlier, you will be notified when your turn arrives. Next one, please. So specifically, what will happen when your date arrives? So if your users are using SSO, no impact, everything stays the same. If they're using username and password to log in into the platform, either via UI or API, they will require MFA. If these human users, so basically, if you have people in your implementation that are using their own accounts for scripts, so let's say I have my Sergio account, I use it to log into Reltio via UI, and I also use that account for a script or for some automation, that automation will stop working because it cannot process the second factor authentication. Similarly, with exclusive service accounts, if they're using client credentials, no impact, nothing changes. If they're using username and password, again, they will stop working because they cannot process that second step authentication. Next one, please. So what are we doing to mitigate any potential disruptions? So we have an exception process in place. We have a lot of customers who send us a list of service accounts they are not able to migrate on time, and we are exempting them from this MFA requirement temporarily. So the extension date, the deadline for these service accounts is February 4th, 2025. So yeah, we'll be receiving a lot of those accounts from you, and those are exempted already from this requirement. However, doing our own research internally, we found additional several hundred of potential service accounts that were not requested by some of you, or maybe you missed some accounts, or some customers didn't propose accounts to exclude from the requirement. So as a preventive measure, we are proactively excluding from the MFA requirement anything that looks like a service account. And it's very important to highlight the concept of everything that looks like a service account, because as users were originally intended to be used by humans, we don't have currently a flag that indicates whether a user is a service account or not. There is no flag like that. So the only way for us to identify these service accounts is through a statistical approach based on login patterns. So we look at origin IP address, we look at frequency of logins, we look at different types of logins. Is it refresh token? Is it password access token? Is it second step authentication, first step authentication, authentication coming from the login page or coming from Postman? So we analyze all these data points for all users, and based on the patterns we see, we identified a lot of hundreds additional service accounts, potential service accounts, and we are excluding them as well from this requirement temporarily until February 4th, 2025. By that, and of course, we will have follow-up communications with all of you, indicating, hey, these are your remaining users. So this doesn't, the communication campaign doesn't stop here. We will continue working with you on this. But just as an FYI, we want to ensure that no service account fails after we do this. So we are taking all possible measures to exempt everything that looks like a service account. Next slide, please. So to finish, please pay attention to your email or in-app messages. We will be notifying you next steps via those channels. You will know specifically which date will MFA, or basically this new requirement, will be enforced on you as a customer. And please, as always, report any consensus issues as soon as possible. And especially after the enforcement, once we notify you of the date, and after that, please raise any apparent issues. Do not wait for a disruption. As soon as you perceive something that may be wrong, let us know, and we will be basically 24/7 trying to help you. If we need to, probably, let's say we roll it out and we found a service account that was missed, we can go and quickly remove it from the MFA requirement. So it's very important to be cautious and pay attention when we do that. Of course, last but not least, continue the migration to plain credentials. Even if we provide exemptions, the migration has to happen anyway. As Andrew mentioned, we are trying to align and make sure that everyone aligns with the standards, and we need service accounts to be on plain credentials. So we're giving you more time, of course, but please do not stop working on this, even if you have the exception. You have a few references here for documentation, how to enable MFA, how to use MFA. Now, that's it for me. We can go through questions.
It looks like we have a question in the chat. How can we update the configuration if we enable the SSO?
What configuration you mean? You mean the user configuration?
Morali, do you want to come off? Do you want to come off mute and ask your question? Or I don't, Sergio, if you want to just, you know,
I can try to guess. So you enable SSO per tenant. So in the Reltio console, you go to each tenant and you enable SSO for the tenant. So whenever a user opens the tenant URL, it will push the user for SSO authentication unless it's already authenticated. If you have users that are not SSO, you can change the flag for that user one by one. Sadly, we don't have right now a way to do that via the UI. It is an API type of change. In the user definition, there is an attribute. I will put it in the chat here called external user. That's on each of your user definitions. And if external user equals true, it means the user is under SSO. If it equals false, it is not under SSO. So that's the only change, changing external user from false to true. Right now, that happens through an API. I had several customers ask me for a way to automate this, and we've been sharing Python scripts to automate that process, so all users can be changed in one step.
I put that relevant documentation in the chat as well.
Sure. Yeah, right. Thank you. How can we ensure that our tenants are in compliance with new security requirements? Can we support review configuration? Yes. If you need us to review your setup to get assurance, we're happy to do it. Please raise a support case, and we will follow up. Anything else? Sure. Okay, so that's it. Again, if you have additional questions, issues, concerns, please raise the support cases. We are happy to follow up. Please remind that please pay attention to your email messages, because we will notify, as a follow-up, we will notify you when your date will come. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining the show. As a reminder, this will be up on the community shortly. And if you have any questions, please reach out through community. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.